Hello, my name is David Bryan, and this is Curiosity Invited, a podcast inspired by endless curiosity. Tune in for an open-minded conversation about interesting and important things. Welcome, everybody. This is Curiosity Invited, and my name is David Bryan, and I have the great pleasure today of speaking with a gentleman I've met only once before, David Bolton. And I'm going to do that thing that I don't particularly love to do. And actually, I don't love to do it usually because it's boring and also because it involves reading, which we'll talk about in a little while. But there's a brief bio that I'm going to read from. And then perhaps if you're willing, David, then we will, maybe we can flesh some of that out and get a different sort of bio as well. So,
okay. Sure.
David Bolton is president of Learning Stewards and director of the Children of the Code project. David Bolton is a learning activist, a term I have never heard before, a learning activist, technologist, public speaker, documentary producer, and author. He's designed Apple Computer's electronic campus back in the day. He's been an advisor to the chair of the California Senate Education Committee, a member of the United States Department of Education's Gateway Project, and a featured blogger for the National Association of School Superintendents. He appeared in the PBS television show, The New Science of Learning, Brain Fitness for Kids, and in the Science Network's The New Science of Educating broadcast. David's current project, the Online Learning Support Network, or OLSN, you'll hear more about that, I hope, is a revolutionary new technology and pedagogy that is redefining how the internet supports learners worldwide. So David, thank you so much for agreeing to have this conversation. And I hope we go to all sorts of places that neither of us imagine at the moment.
Wonderful. That'd be great.
Good. So I just read that, that the stuff, but how did that come to be? Like, were you one of those people who knew from age 5, I want to be a teacher when I grow up, or I want to be involved in education, or where did that come from?
Absolutely not. I totally disliked everything about education as a student. Just totally, which is a story unto itself. I was about 30 years old. I'd already formed a company when I was 26 years old. We made the robotic machines that made the initial plated discs that made personal computers possible. And so I was 30 years old winning the game, The Guy Who Dies with the Most Toys Wins, kind of that whole thing, Silicon Valley in its early heyday. My previous experience had been a yield analysis engineer for Signetics, which was one of the first chip makers before such thing as microprocessors.
What is a yield analysis technologist? What does that mean?
In that day, semiconductors are grown on disks, right? And it's a very complicated process of depositing things and chemicals and photoresist and exposure, and to grow this many layers and process those layers into something that acts as a functional device, a semiconductor. As a young man, one of my jobs was working in one of those companies when it was in the early days. The biggest RAM chip on the planet was 256 bits.
Oh, wow.
Okay, that's how big, right? And I'm looking back in the day, and I'm looking through microscopes and trying to find out what's going wrong with the fabrication of these things. So that was one of my backgrounds. The other background I had concurrent to that was in relay logic for building security systems for the Atomic Energy Commission for a company also in Silicon Valley. So I was doing these two jobs. Anyway, I formed my own company.
Is that because your training was did you go to school for engineering?
Nope. No. I took some quantum physics related to semiconductor analysis while I was in college, but no, I never finished college and I never went on any of those tracks formally. I just learned my way in.
Yeah.
anyway, through a long process, divorce, following wife, kids, all that kind of stuff, I ended up forming a company of my own that welded my semiconductor and computer experience with my chemical processing and relay logic experience to make these robotic machines that were $500,000 to $1 million a pop back in 1980 that made the plated discs that were used in computers, as well as circuit boards and other kinds of stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
And so by the time I was 30, I have 100 people working for me, a big factory, could build anything you can imagine with your mind. I have a small computer company on the side that's building the guts of the minds of these robots that are doing all this work. And I went on, the only way I could describe it is a kind of a strange learning binge where I started to use the computers to journal myself. And the consequence of that process and my growing appetite for learning and a few other things that went, oops, get rid of that, led me to this kind of transformation of sorts where I came to realize that I could learn anything because I was very frustrated with the materials I was learning from, library stuff, documentaries, audiobooks, books. There was always this kind of presumption of proximity of learner and writer, right? There's this very narrow gap of readiness you had to be in order to be able to get at that stuff. And it really bothered me because I realized I could learn anything if who or what I was learning from could meet me on the edge of what I needed to stay in it.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
That hit me like an atom bomb. And one other thing that happened in that time frame that was really important to me was all my life I'd kind of grown up thinking somebody out there knows, right? There's this kind of it is so-ness tone that permeates the way books and the authoritarian professorial it is so tone that radiates through everything. And yet the closer I got in my inquiries to anything that was vital, whether it was quantum physics or various dimensions of philosophy or interpretations of mythology or geology or just, well, you name it, anything that was a vital science or inquiry dimension that touched on what is really important, right? There's a raging argument going on there.
Yes, right.
Right. So
And
somehow.
and that's where the interesting stuff really happens, right?
That's
right
where the interesting stuff. Exactly. And so what that did was shatter the illusion that it was about knowledge. And that coupled with the other point that I just made said it's all about learning. It's not about the knowledge is, like I would say today, knowledge, the power of knowledge is its resourcefulness to learning. It's always temporally, it's always got a narrow temporal window of actual validity and value other than that, right? So those two things, to add, long way around back to the start of your question,
I get it.
That's where the learning commitment came in, which was, when I was 30 years old.
And what did that make you do? That learning commitment, so you had this aha. And so how do you get from running these companies to what you then embarked on? You're a learning activist, whatever that means, right? What does that mean?
Yeah.
By the way?
Well, I did invent that term. It doesn't exist anywhere out there except me. And it means everything you could imagine by the juxtaposition of those two words, whether it's in terms of supporting an individual and activating their learning, or being an activist about reframing how we think about learning at a general public level. So it means both of those, all those things you can imagine together in one.
So how'd you get to that? How'd you take what did the step from I'm running these companies to I'm really interested in how people learn, and at least from what I've read, you didn't gravitate to any place. You gravitated to the education world, or at least people who were thinking about the world called education. So how'd you get there?
Well, yes and no. I mean, a big part of this is just as I was coming out of this, year-long learning binge that I just described that resulted in that shattering of knowledge and that sense that anybody could learn anything, not just me. I wasn't thinking that was me. I was thinking I was everybody. that frustration and tension in me with the way things are is something everybody's experiencing, and that anybody could learn anything if they were met in the right way. So those things collided me, and just at that time, a baby boy's born. My son, right?
Yeah.
My second son.
Yeah.
And he is this exhibit, this living spiritual being that's also incredibly innocent and intelligent and exhibiting all that's great about human beingness and how human beingness learns without any preconceptions, right there with me, right? And so our journey together revealed so much to me. So, and it was while I was working on how to describe what we were talking about before, the knowledge, the learning. And one of the tactics I took with him when he was an infant was that I never read to him baby books. I never read to him little books. I read to him what I was reading for myself and just modulated it emotionally in a way that he could kind of track with, right? That had lots of neurocognitive linguistic benefits to him, which showed up later. But for me, it meant that he wasn't somehow separated from my work. Him and I were in this together, kind of merged into this flow of learning together, me out over here, extending in one dimension and him on another. So while in the course of doing this, and while in the course of writing what would be a kind of a multi-level publication that would work differently in the electronic world, what I would later call electronic publishing for learning, a way of creating a relationship with information that has an elastic responsivity to the articulation or expression of learning or meaning needs that would deal with the problem that we were talking about before, right? So I was designing that, working on that in one part of my life. And then on the other part, I was really troubled by having to disturb him to turn pages. So I developed an electronic book, right?
Really?
I developed, this was 1984 or 85, right? Kind of thing. So I developed what was a digital display touch thing that I could just, anyway, I designed all that, and I designed how to use improve analog decoding technology to increase the information density in analog data streams, right? And a few other things. And I got the attention of some investors and some other people, and my life started to change from the work that I was doing before to starting to build technologies that could support the kind of learning I was on about. That brought me to—
And you were convinced at that moment early on that the solution, for lack of a better word, that the solution to the challenge that we were just speaking about before of not being able to meet or be met in that moment was going to be a technological one.
No.
Here's why I'm asking that question. Because you, as you spoke about reading to your son,
right,
you're reading things that are, quote, above his head, right? He'd never bump into any of those things, and yet you were able to read to him in a way where that was about, you made that motion, right? Like it was somehow tempo and—
yeah, he was mesmerized. He was tracking with me energetically through this.
Yes.
Yeah.
So what convinced you that the solution was going to be in technology? I'm not, this is not challenging. I'm really—
No. That's a beautiful question. And there's an important part to it. It's not that the important part of learning is about information and technology. It's not. I just thought that it was the least defended place to make a change. And that's a more complicated question to get into. But our relationship with information is fundamentally learning disabling, the way that it is, in that it requires this conformity, this readiness, this pre-preparation, whether we're talking about decoding skills or vocabulary or background knowledge or all kinds of layers that it takes to be ready to learn from something that's static, right?
Yes.
By making that more elastic and responsive to what somebody needs, then that whole thing becomes a different kind of portal that can demonstrate the value of stewarding learning in a more efficient way, in a better way, right? So it wasn't that that I think that the fundamental problem, I'm at the same time I'm doing this, working on these technologies, and which brings me to the attention of Apple Computer, which is where another dimension takes off. I'm also very interested and drawn to the work of David Bohm, right?
Sure.
I was scheduled to meet Krishnamurti just before he died, right? But not being able to meet him, I did meet David Bohm. And later I actually arranged to bring him to Apple Computer to speak at Apple, right? Before, and worked with Senge and others to try to make that happen.
Yeah.
But my work with Bohm, what Bohm hit me like a lightning bolt with was think implicately. Right? I mean, you're familiar with Bohm's work in implicate order and all that kind of stuff. And so the idea of the implicate order applied to learning really blew me open to another level. Right?
Say more about that. Can you?
Well, one of the things that I was really interested in in my observations of children, and I spent a lot of time both watching my son, but also his friends and cousins. I had 17 cousins, he'd hang out with, nieces and nephews of mine that because of my parents' prolificness, that kind of thing, right?
Did you get all their names straight?
No. I couldn't tell you who they are anymore.
That makes me feel better.
Yeah. Anyway, I became really fascinated with a number of questions about how children were processing the world. For example, it was really clear to me that they're making discernments about preferences and objects and making decisions and what have you before they have language to mediate the process, right? Which means that they're making nonverbal discernments, or discernments that are not based on verbal distinctions anyway, right?
Yeah.
All right. So there's a relationship between this nonverbal realm, right, and the verbal realm. And my sense is that the efficiency of learning is dependent on how they co-implicate, right? So that's the point with Bohm, was that their relationship is not some kind of linear ordered thing. It's a mutual co-implication, that the nonverbal and the verbal, when they co-implicate, they have a depth of integration that allows for a transfer.
Yes.
That's not possible if it's associational and linear.
Right.
Right?
I get it. Yes.
Okay.
Understood.
Yeah.
Understood. Okay. So wait, no, now get back to it. So, and Apple, I asked the question about what convinced you that it was
right.
technological. And you said, well, it was the other thing. You were watching your son's cousins, et cetera, et cetera. Do you remember where we were going? I'm sorry I asked that question.
No, don't be sorry. Unless you need to, not for me anyway.
No, I'm okay.
Good. Yeah. Again, because I was so stuttered and obstructed by the static presuppositions about information mediated learning, it was certainly a part of what was going on for me. But I also realized the more that I started to interact with educators, people at Apple, that the paradigm inertia in education is stunning. I mean, you might as well be talking about arguing Christians out of whether a cross exists. I mean, there's a real attachment to particular ways of looking at all of this.
Yeah.
And all of that retards dissipates reduces our capacity to make the kind of changes as it relates to learning that we got to make. And that information was an area that exhibited all of our problems, particularly reading, and that's where we're getting to, right?
Yes, right.
But it was the least defended, at least so I thought at the time.
Yeah. Yeah, you reminded me of oh gosh, am I going to remember it? As you were speaking, Buckminster Fuller, who sort of in frustration talked about how it takes a minimum of 75 years for a new idea, a new discovery to make its way into the curriculum. And so imagine 75 years later. I mean, you might as well, like, what's the point? Right?
Yeah, well,
Because by then it's so far past that. What do you wait another 75 years? But yes, it is such a constrained territory.
yeah,
That,
yeah,
the world of education and the assumptions about education. And
yeah,
so,
yeah, yeah. Which is the core of where I've come to really is that, what are those assumptions and what can challenge them out in a way that they can actually change rather than just inspire greater resistance to change.
well, there's a goal.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
Well, I mean, to me, there's nothing more important.
yes. Well, in so many ways, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, but you somehow managed to get the ears of, or at least an ear of, people who were working in the world of education. So how did that happen? I mean,
I did a talk in Cupertino, and one of the administrators at Cupertino Union School District, which was Apple's playground and prototyping space at the time, really took a shine to what I was saying about, at this point, the design of the learner interface. And basically my point of the technological design, not to digress too much, but to try to nail this thing quickly, was that we're focused on what they should learn or how they should learn it. And I've been concerned with, how do we create an environment that's sufficiently granularly responsive to their articulations and expressions of learning and meaning needs, that it creates an opportunity for them to get better at expressing their meaning needs and learning needs as the central as a central driver in their participation. Mm-hmm. Right. And that comes from, if you watch a child when they're doing anything, and this is a big distinction between natural and artificial modes of learning that the information relationship cuts right in the middle of. If you watch children as they're learning in natural, organic ways, they're using a compass to navigate with, that's basically the differentiation and disambiguation of their own proprioceptive flow.
Right.
Yes. So right. Feeling themselves start to walk, paying attention to the feedback they're getting just in the emotional dance with another, manipulating an object, and the tactile feedback there. It's all right on the live edge of right now. Right. And they're getting this feedback in direct correspondence to what they're doing on that edge as they extend into becoming more present and more facile in different domains of existence. That's the core of human learning, right? The artificial learning requires us to completely subordinate that and make learning right or wrong in relation to an external, conventional, technological set of goals, assumptions, right, wrongs, correctness, et cetera, right? So it takes them out of having that compass and out into this consensual technological system. And that's where the breakdown is. I think the majority of kids that really have most trouble is they smash into that like a wall, because their organizational evolutionary instantiation with respect to learning has no truck with that. It doesn't know what to do with that.
Right.
And because we don't pay attention to that difference, we don't build a ladder or a bridge between those two.
No,
right?
and to make it worse, speaking as a guy who was in the world of education as one of those people, to make it worse, because the human population is large and diverse, there are some people who bump into that artificial edge and do it successfully, and so they become that's the proof that we're doing it right.
Yep.
And everybody who struggles with that, well, somehow they're missing something. Now we're
Yep.
missing something, or we just happen to be, looking at that thin slice of the world that unfortunately is programmed that way, happens to be that way.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it
The best example of
becomes
that.
more and more entrenched. So,
Yep.
yeah.
Yep. The best example of that to me was Obama, right? The difference between Race to the Top and No Child Left Behind
Yes.
is really, it's really that, right? In that people that come through this and are successful, it's very hard for them to be able to, and they can have a model, they can have an idea, they can have a mental image about what it must be like to not do it, but they don't have a first person experience of what that's like.
Right.
And one of the things that really bothers me when you look at this, and I don't know if you've seen any of the charts that I put out about this, but we've been flatlined with respect to educational progress on virtually every significant measure for as long as we've been keeping data. More than 2/3 of the kids are chronically underwater in everything we think is important. And it gets worse depending upon, social economic status and race.
That occurs at the policy level and the individual child level. So, a kid doesn't get algebra, fails algebra. What do? We make that child repeat algebra, and frequently the same teacher. It's like, and doing the same coursework and the same. So it's like, okay, how stupid are we? I mean, really?
Exactly.
It has to stare. I mean, we're staring it right in the face, and well, let's work harder this time. Work harder.
Well, this to me, this is the core, right? I mean, why do we do that? Because we have a fundamental misperception of the role of learning, how learning works, and the role of learning in human life. We tend to think of it in very, very narrow ways. And the ways we think about learning disable our learning. And, I hope that we'll get to that as we progress. That's the real core of things for me.
Please, I'll tell you, as I was reading through your stuff, that I never thought of it that way, but I'm going to misquote, so you can correct it. But you were writing about someone trying to learn, and they come upon a word they don't know, and at that moment they're alone. They are now suddenly alone. They don't have the only feedback they have is no. Right? No, that's not it. Try it again. No, that's not it. And there they are. There they are, all by themselves. And, either they get lucky or they don't, or they happen to get a clue from somebody else, or they scramble through all the protocols that if they can remember them. Oh, wait, that's an A and it sounds like ah, so maybe that's ah. And it's like, but they're out there by themselves, which it really hit me like I just got hit in the chest, partially because of my own struggle learning to read and especially learning to read out loud, which was sort of, and on top of this challenge, I now have the public performance to read aloud and have an audience know that I am floundering out there by myself. And it was just like, wow, that is so true. And the other thing I just want to say, and maybe I'm speaking too much, but as you were speaking, I remember this was before I got into education, whatever that means. I was in it because I was a student, but I remember sitting in Washington Square Park in New York City, and watching skateboarders and trying to learn a trick over and over and over. There was so much conversation about, kids don't do homework, or they're lazy, or they're like whatever. Johnny doesn't work hard enough. And it's like, and here nobody's forcing anybody to do anything. These kids want to learn this trick because they fall and then they get up and it's exactly that thing. There's no language necessarily involved in this. Nobody's saying, like, nobody's saying, like the coaches say to a baseball player, you're dropping your shoulder, maybe, but they are adjusting based on that experience they just had without language, right? But with something else. And it's such an obvious, well, it ought to be such an obviously instructive moment for people,
Yeah.
or just that, just the way in which kids in our culture and in every other culture in the world, what do kids do? They act like their parents. They mimic. Let's play house. I'm going to be the mom. You're going to be the dad. Whatever the hell they do. This is how you hunt. This is how you. And then whoosh, we send them to school, and all of a sudden, there's a resistance to learning. What's that about? Well, it's that. It's all that stuff. They just hit this wacky thing, and there's no help. There's no help telling them where to go with it. So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, the point about the skateboarding in particular is interesting in that the skateboard is artificial, right? It's not something that occurs in nature,
Right.
But learning it is natural.
It's completely.
Right?
Yes.
And that's the difference between the artificial and natural that's generally lost on people, but so important. When you get to reading, you're talking about something it's not just that it's artificial, it's bizarrely artificially confusing.
Yes.
Right? In a way that we wouldn't let any machine in the world run a code that is as bizarrely messed up and confused as the code that will determine the fate of our children's lives if they don't get it right by the time they're 7.
Right.
Right? It's just bizarre.
Yes.
Yeah. I jump, some years forward from where we left the story just to get into the reading conversation and kind of make this more real. It also brings in our mutual friend, Gary David, who I met shortly after this time at Apple, right?
Ah.
So my son, when I told you I was reading to when he was a baby, when he gets to school, right? I'm working at Apple. I'm working on this electronic book stuff, but I'm not paying attention to reading at all. I'm assuming reading. I'm assuming just like I could read, I was assuming these other dimensions of how to correlate multitude of representations so that somebody can imagine learning through information like learning through a microscope that has rings. You can spin through the rings to find the representation that makes it come home for you. Right? That kind of stuff, right? So a different mental scope for relating to information. It's working on that. So one day, my 5-year-old son, who I never explicitly taught to read, comes home from kindergarten with a book in his hand, and he points to me at a word, and he says, "Dad, it can't be like that." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And here's a kid at 5 years old, his kindergarten teacher says, "This boy's got the vocabulary of a 20-year-old. Right? So he was verbally dexterous. He's really bright. He learned all kinds of stuff on his own. He was just we were together in this kind of learning journey in our dialogues and whiteboard. He had a whiteboard space in my office, whatever, right? But anyway, he comes home with this book and he points to it and he says, "It can't be like that." And for the first time in my adult life, I experienced the confusion a verbally dexterous, bright young mind is having as they encounter this code.
What was the word?
I forget the word. I wish I could remember. But wow, it blew me away.
If this becomes a movie, if it becomes a movie, you need to remember the word. Yeah, I get it.
Yeah. Anyway, I wrote at the time I wrote a paper. I said, you know what? In the days of old, when we had no choice but to print things in a way that the characters once printed were dead, or because of the cost efficiency, we couldn't make 25 variations of a letter A, that the printer could change in and out. But with desktop publishing, we got a whole lot of new dexterities. that we could, my original idea was, we could change the dimensional presence of a letter without changing its character recognition features in stepped ways, so that it tells you which of its possible sounds it's actually making in any word you're looking at, right? So we could make the letters visual appearance variations cue you to their sounds as you were reading, to knock out the letter sound confusion, which is at the core of stuttering up reading minds, right? So I wrote a paper about that, and I shared it with about 1,000 educators in the time. They all thought I was from fucking Mars. They just, and I kind of gave up on it after, I mean, I thought it was important, but after putting it out there, and I was busy with other stuff, and I helped my son get through the reading thing by understanding where his confusions were, and just being able to listen to him read. And when he started to stumble or stutter, be able to interject and cue him with my voice as to which of those letters he was stuttering on, and off he would go. So he took off. 2 weeks later, he was reading like a rocket, no concern. And I forgot about reading for a while.
Wow. How old was he? 5. He was in
5.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. And then it came back, because what you were speaking about was the beginnings. I'm assuming the beginnings of what isn't Olson. Yeah.
No, that's much later. No.
Oh.
So anyway, I was working on, I'm going to skip over a big part, 10 years later now, right?
Yeah.
I've got a daughter, and she's now 5 years old. She had some speech issues when she was younger. And she hit school, and me and her mother are in this kind of differencing. This is where I meet Gary, because she originally came in through her. And I recognize my daughter's problem. She goes to a preschool that teaches her in a different way than kindergarten does and first grade does. By the time she gets to kindergarten and first grade, she's having all the problems my son had with the bizarre confusion, but she's got an auditory memory processing deficit, which means that even if she works out the word in sentence 1, she experiences it again in sentence 2. She's got to start all over again. She can't remember that she did it.
Right.
And I just watch her start to die. Shame out. I've got, video of her at that time. It's just I can't tell you. And that changed my life. And just to show you how the universe works, there's an interesting little side story that kicks this in Children of the Code off. She's right when we're starting to recognize that she's got a problem, and I'm starting to come out of my other universe and focus again on reading. We're at a garage sale, and I'm off in one corner, she's in another corner. She comes up to me with this book. She hands it to me, says, how about we read this together, Daddy? And it's King Arthur and His Noble Knights by John Steinbeck. John Steinbeck, I said, wow. And I opened the first part of the book up, and it says, some people there are who, being grown, forget the horrible task of learning to read. It is the hardest thing a human being ever does, and they have to do it as a child. That's its first paragraph.
Wow.
He goes on to describe how, despite becoming a Nobel Prize, for author, right, for literature, how he grew up just terrified. He thought letters were the most cruel, inhuman inventions ever in history, until he accidentally stumbled across a manuscript of Mort d'Arthur from the 15th century, original King Arthur in Old English, which for some reason made sense to his mind. And because the code cohered, he took off.
That's great. That's,
Yeah.
I mean, it sort of chokes me up. That kind of, again, because it's I'm seeing your daughter, and I'm seeing myself. That struggle, which was just.
Yeah. Fortunately, at this point in time, Gary comes into my life a lot more. my work on learning up to this point has been all these dimensions we've talked about, and I've been very concerned about emotions, but I've never really given it the kind of granularized thought that Gary would bring in as we started to talk about shame and shame's role. And as I started to witness this happening in my daughter, right? So now I'm more concerned with how this artificial confusion is causing her and millions of kids like her who are struggling. They may not have the auditory memory processing deficit as some kind of a basis. They may be unready for any number of other reasons that we could talk about ad nauseum, right? As far as early life learning trajectories, preparing them for the challenge. But what we're talking about is children losing faith in learning.
And themselves.
Children, and what faith can they have in themselves if they don't have faith in their learning?
Right, but if they don't see it as something visiting them from the outside. There's something wrong with me.
That's right. That's right. That's right. The most common thing, and if you go to when I started to do the research that would begin Children of the Code, the literature on this from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development and other ones was the first casualty, the first consequence of protracted difficulty is self-blame, right? It is this self-blame triggered shame, right? So yeah, the kids, they don't have the meta reflectiveness to say, hey, this code's a mess. I shouldn't have to deal with this. Or why the hell didn't my mom talk to me more when I was in a crib?
Right.
You know, or what was with my preschool teacher, didn't know what the hell she was doing, you know, or they don't have any of that. All they know is that I should be doing this and I'm not doing this. There's something wrong with me.
They can do it. And they can do it. Whatever. They do it best of all, but I can't do it. Yeah. Brutal.
Yeah. And that's really the core for me to this day is that in a way, what I talked to before about how education is not so
receptive.
Yeah, I mean, the reading wars are reminiscent of the Crusades, right? Of these religious belief systems fighting with each other.
Absolutely.
Right. So I ended up interviewing 100 or so scholars, and I sat across from the person who is responsible for the greatest amount of research in this field, who was the Czar of American reading, right? Who reported to Congress for 3 decades, and all the presidents at that time worked for those directly for the presidents, right? At the National Institute of Health, right, ran the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development branch that focused all of the government money on reading research. And I said, so what we're talking about then is the majority of our children are having their lives all but faded by the difficulty they're encountering learning to relate to a technological artifact, to an archaic artifact. And he said, oh, you mean lousy teaching?
So the solution was to hire better teachers?
To train them in the ways that they were supposed to be trained.
Right. And the ways they were supposed to be trained was the war. That was those were the reading wars.
Yep.
Good luck.
I had a conversation with a guy by the name of Keith Stanovich, who was the chair of cognitive science for the country of Canada, one of the premier cognitive scientists in the world. After 3 or 4 hours of conversation with him, got to a similar spot, you know. And what he said is, you know, that he really appreciated where I was framing all of this, but that once I got down to the correspondence between code confusion and reading difficulties, I had to be really careful because they didn't want to go there. They didn't want to go there because that's what caused whole language to get risen. And that's what caused the reading wars. And they're talking to, and all these people have been badly burned by decades of reading wars. And they just got the engine on the phonics train and they don't
Oh
want
my
it messed
God.
with.
Wow.
That last part is a compilation of all of the experts.
Yes.
His point was, we've been badly burned. We don't want to go there, right?
Yeah.
This is from a world-class scientist,
Wow.
right? And that was the case with most of them. I'd get right to that edge and that's where we'd have a problem. So we have this enormous institutional and paradigmatic inertia that is undermining the kind of learning that could make learning more effective for our children. And 2/3 or more of our children are going off the rails into being ashamed of their minds because of their difficulties with this artificial confusion, right? To me, it's like, well, of course we live in a learning disabled population.
Mm-hmm. Is there a happy ending to this story? I don't mean ending, but is there a, did you one day take a turn and, you knocked on the door and it opened? I mean that in the sense of, how is your work here? I had several sort of questions floating in my mind. How has your work been received? That's clear. Or at least in many knockings of doors, nobody answered. But are there places where you've been able to get a foot in the door and then have somebody said, yes, come on in. We need this.
Yeah, more so in the learning theory work. I mean, there are people that are picked up and are moving with the other parts of my work that we haven't really talked about yet, and that my talks are about and stuff like that. Yes, on the reading side, I've given up on conventional education. Yeah. I'm working with a group of what's called a W3C group, which is a group of folks that are developing the next standards for the evolution of the World Wide Web. I'm in the process of developing a case that I want to get to Apple and Microsoft and Amazon and Google and to the World Wide Web Consortium and others that says, by transforming the way words work online, we can transform learning on the whole planet. And so I'm building a case for doing that and the technological exhibits for that. And those things are largely done. The technology parts are working and people are using them. But yeah, it's a long slug. I mean, this goes back to the core of the work, right? People's ideas about what learning is, which tend to be that learning isn't, I mean, in fact, if you look it up on Google, or you look it up in a dictionary, or you look it up in most encyclopedias, the definition of learning will come across as if it's some kind of an ancillary utility for the acquisition of knowledge, skills, and experience. Right? That's the problem. Right. By thinking of learning this way, all the other dimensions of our learning are invisible to us. Right? Or they're attributed to other causes, and therefore they misorient our action. Right.
That has nothing to do with what we're really trying to solve here. Right.
Yeah. So my main work is changing that. Like, how do we do that? And so in talks and writings and other things I'm working on, it's like, how do we change our central definition, our operational definition of learning, so that it becomes, instead of this ancillary mental utility, the central dynamic of how human beings become who they become in every way. There's no part of human agency that isn't determined by learning. There's lots of things that happen that are outside the scope of our agency, but inside the scope of our agency, there's nothing that happens that isn't affected by, if not totally destined by, learning. Mm-hmm. From eating habits and body inhabiting to emotional regulation to you name it, right? The linguistic, all the academic stuff, which is just the surface of it. Yeah, exactly. And so until such time as we expand that definition, we're not going to get any changes in any fundamental way to what it is that's causing human beings to become so learning disabled in our population.
data is pretty clear, right? I mean, it's like there's a lot of kids being quote left behind, right? I mean, it's like
Most,
but even worse than that, being left behind, damaged,
yeah.
wounded, in a deeply wounded emotionally, and we know that, and you know, keep banging our head into this wall, and it's like, well, wait, why is this okay? Why is this not like really important?
I hear that, but I choose to think that um, parents in particular
Well, parents,
and many educators really do love their children,
absolutely,
and therefore it's a misdirected care,
right, right.
right? So they don't
That's a
realize.
better way to put it. Thank you.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I really think that, and there's the hope and opportunity,
yes,
right? Because if parents, I mean, one of the ways I used to describe that is because I remember this was a kid, I'd go to my house and I'd be standing out on the porch of the front yard because I didn't want to bleed on the house. I would cut my knee or something and I'm bleeding all over the place. Hey, mom, come out here, And mom comes out, they takes a look at you and says, oh yeah, well, we've got to take you for stitches. No, we don't. There's this kind of intuitive sense of how to take care of our various physical ailments and traumas and what have you. Total obliviousness to the learning side of that,
yeah,
right? And therein lies the difficulty, the challenge, and the opportunity, right? So rather than thinking that, because we tend to, parents tend to think that they've got to learn some, Dr. Spockian, nth generation knowledge bank of how-tos to be a parent, rather than to just orient themselves towards learning into meeting the learning.
yes. And when you see those stories, and there are those stories of parents who, whatever it was, had a hunch, just couldn't watch their kids suffer more, and pushed and pushed and pushed. The results are frequently miraculous, both in terms of insight and their own child, but also insight and program. And I'm thinking of so when I was at New Roads, this woman walked in. Her daughter was leaving middle school someplace, and it was a middle school that had grown up from elementary years. So it was, as many of those schools are, it was a middle school that had a very elementary school flavor, which is really saturated in love and care and embrace. And, for the most part, they cherish the kids. And so this girl who was on the spectrum in a significant way, autistic, she might have had a severe autism, Asperger's. And here she came to interview at a high school. And it was clear in, 30 seconds. The social aspect of this was so challenging. And this woman, bless her heart, said, it's just, and I was pretty honest with her. I said, I don't know if this is going to work. She said, it's just so backwards. It's so backwards. It's like, I don't care if she gets through calculus or algebra, or it's not the curriculum that matters. It's the social piece. It's her learning how to be with other human beings and she said, I wish there was a place where it was just backwards and upside down, where the focus was on that rather than, and we talked a little more, and I said, well, there's got to be programs, there's got to be a place. She said, I have looked everywhere. It just doesn't exist. And I said, well, why don't we start one? So we did. We started this program at the school, where these kids these were highly functional kids on the spectrum, who they could do the curriculum, but they could do calculus, but don't ask them to go to 7-Eleven and get change, because the social interaction was beyond them. So we started a program that was essentially upside down that way. And instances of that where parents just, they saw what their kids really needed in a way that educators, theoretically, educators didn't, and made it happen. So
That's a wonderful story. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
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 The program still goes on. It's happily, it's still going on. So
yeah. 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 I was involved with, I've never had a direct experience working with kids on the spectrum myself. So I don't have anything to contribute there other than my sense that your approach of kind of how do you develop a learning environment, the intention of which is to bring out that kind of emotional presence and participation, right? How do you actually create the conditions in which that will be extended? How do you, I mean, like any other kind of learning, you're always looking at how to vivify the differentiation.
yes.
Right.
Yes.
So
and
that's really
it's
cool.
Interesting too, even the stuff that is frequently still said about kids on the spectrum, that well, they don't have an interest in, it's completely the opposite. It's like they want that social interaction. They want the love, they want the care, like, it's so backwards, and it's so obvious when you're working with those kids. And I don't pretend to be an expert in any way about that, but in this little corner is just like, wait, folks have no idea who these kids are, and they're pretty fabulous. Yeah. And yeah, they're different. Yeah,
yeah,
they really are. So
yeah, my that brings me to the conversation space of learning disabilities, or what's called often learning disabilities.
Yeah.
And that's another one of the areas where paradigm inertia is so rampant inside of the system, in that, for example, I had a long conversation with the executive director of the National Center for Learning Disabilities. And I really wanted to draw out the fact that there's a significant part of the population who has what I would call acquired learning disabilities, meaning that their learning has been disabled by their learning.
Yes.
Not, in other words, it's not innately, structurally, maturationally ordained by their bio-neurological unfoldment, right? They learned in ways that skewed their learning.
Their problem is they went to school. The problem is they went to school.
Or they had a traumatic environmental thing go on for them at home, or their home environment was so weak in exercising the prerequisites for success in school that they slammed into the wall in school that other kids just went right through, not because of any innate lack of capacity, but because their capacities weren't developed prior to that intersect point with school in their early life learning life trajectory. So there's so many things that can cause this, but my point was, whether you talk about dyslexia, what percentage of dyslexia is actually genetically, neurobiologically ordained, and what part has to do with maladaptive learning early on that's creating a trajectory that's inappropriate for taking off in reading, and that creates what would seem to be, to all observers, dyslexia, right? We don't have the instrumentation to really tease that stuff out really well. But what I would say is that for every kid who has a innate neurobiologically ordained learning disability, we got 10 kids who have got just about as learning disabled, so to speak. Got to always put that in quotes. That weren't disabled because of the way they were born or their genes, but were disabled because of their learning, because of what they couldn't help but learn in, or couldn't help but not learn in their learning environments. Mm-hmm. And we don't care about them because we've created a legal line to limit the financial liability of support for kids around that line where we can say, well, they were born that way, therefore we care about them. If they learn to be that way, sorry, we can't help them.
They're just underachievers.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is shifting gears, or I want to get to the stuff that you're doing now, and especially I want you to talk about Olson, and then we can talk about what you want to talk
about. Okay, fair enough. So you remember my point early on about being able to vary the appearance of letters so as to cue the mind as to which of the letters possible sounds it's actually making in any particular word you're looking at.
Yes.
Well, I originally did that static. In other words, I actually made fonts that could do that, so that you ended up with a printed piece of paper with all kinds of strange looking font variations, which research showed didn't matter to perception. That's another conversation. But I wasn't making it dynamic and active at the time. I was just making it statically more readable by changing the variation on the page. About 5 years ago, 6 years ago now, I for the past 15 years or so, I've been working on electronic versions of that. In other words, electronic display versions of that. But about 5 years ago, I started to come up with a different variation of that, which was rather than having the whole page appear that way with these variations, which caused people that could read some discomforts, right? Sure. That it could make it so that anybody could touch any word on any online document, and right at that moment that they touched it, immediately get a box that opens up and that guides them through how to work out how those letters make the sounds that make that word have the sound that it has, right? So that you could get a tutorial on a per word level using these kind of cues, but now instead of being static, they're kind of in an animated form so that they can guide you through word recognition. Now, this has two dimensions to it, all the way back to the beginning we talked about having all these different reasons why somebody might have difficulty learning from something they're reading, right? So that we can use the word as a portal. So rather than thinking of a word as an object or just having a link to a discrete resource, that a word is a portal. And inside that portal, once clicked, instantly upon being clicked, it has all the resources packed into it to coach anybody, regardless of their language background, their primary language, their reading skill, their vocabulary, into how to recognize that word, how to be able to pronounce and recognize it so that the sound of it and the print of it, so to speak, lock together, co-implicate, as we talked about earlier. Mm-hmm. But also, while they're there, there's an adjacent button inside the little box that if they touch that, it will open up a relevant reference library related to that word. So anything somebody might need in order to understand its definition, how it translates into any one of the world's languages, an encyclopedia-like elaboration, synonyms for it, the roots of the word, in case that was helpful, so that, and ultimately that can expand to be anything that anybody needs. Point being that rather than having to, and this is the big thing, that Olson has two parts to it. One is the learning to read, and the other is the reading to learn, right? So with the learning to read, it's actually what's the most controversial part of it, which is to say, rather than having to abstractly train brains to have the reflexive response to confusion and have the skills and the abstract knowledge of how words work and letters and sounds work, to be able to work through that confusion to word recognition in the solitary confines of their mind, right? Which is the way it's been for thousands of years, right? Forever. That touching the word would provide everything that somebody could need to learn that word right there, right now, right live, which is the way kids learn everything else. If you remember our conversations about the skateboard, for example, right? Yeah, right. So they could skateboard through learning the word rather than having to have it all crammed into their head, which is where the breakdown happens and has been happening for decades.
Right.
So one thing is to solve for the reading problem that way. And the other thing is to solve for the reading to learn problem by saying, well, I recognize the word, but damned if I know what it means.
What the hell is that? Right.
What does it mean here? So again, right there, without having to guess and jump and hopefully, contextually backfill or any of the other, questionable strategies that kids evolve or, adapt to. That the point being in both cases, and this goes all the way also back to what we talked about early on, right? The most important thing we can do is exercise their awareness that, hey, something ain't right. Something's not working here, right? What is it I need? Oh yeah, let me go get that. That dynamic of being a participant rather than, a manipulated object,
Yes.
right? That participation, that kind of becoming ever more discriminating of and differentiating of and trusting of and able to disambiguate their own needs and act on those needs, that's the center of their power to learn.
You bet.
Right? So how do we create the environment to do that? Well, Olson is that at both the learning to read level and at the reading to learn level. And doesn't go with all the other dimensions that I'd ultimately like to do, but it's a start.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. And has that been, have you had any success sort of embedding that into even one classroom? I mean, like somebody must want to jump on this and say, wait, this is really interesting. This is really, no, not yet.
Yeah. Yes and no. We once had a situation with a local school district, Louisville School District. There's 100,000 kids here, 55,000 kids underwater every day. Right. And that's a conservative.
That's you being generous.
That's cooked books, right?
Yeah.
So we went in there and we had a researcher from Bellarmine University as part of our third-party objective researcher watching what we're doing. At the time, we didn't have the Olson Touch It and It Supports You. We had a variation of the printed on paper or on screens. But we did a couple of trials with third graders and fifth graders and sixth graders, and the trial results were great. The guys, the guy was really a big advocate. Unfortunately, Bellarmine University had a contract with JCPS, right? That was a very lucrative contract about how to train teachers to teach kids to read.
Wow.
And and our success was a contaminating factor.
Oh wow. Yeah, that's a shame. Yeah, that's criminal.
Yeah, well, yeah, but that said, there are other websites. There's a school right now that's spinning up in Taiwan that's using our stuff for ESL. There's the story preservation thing that's using it for older kids. But I'm not pushing. First of all, I don't have the financial bandwidth to market it. And I've never been a marketer in the sense that I'm trying to persuade or, to play the game that way. Mm-hmm. I'm more interested in kind of challenging the dialogue. And, so like I said, the technology Olson is available as a 5-line script that can be built into any website. So if you had a website and you knew what you were doing, or you had a webmaster, in 10 minutes, they could put some script into your website and every word on your website would work this way. Boom. If you have a Chrome browser or an Edge browser, you can download a little thing, an extension to your web browser. And once it's on the web browser, you can go to any page on the web, any one of billions of pages. Click a button and every word on that page will work this way right now.
That's phenomenal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the reading research people that were my fans during the days of Children of the Code, before I was advocating for any kind of solutions, right? I was just poking the bear then, that, I wish you could interview some of them and get their take on it. But my sense is that their reputations and incomes are deeply committed to various paradigms about teaching reading that what I'm talking about completely upends.
Right.
Right? Everything about phonics and whole language and Orton Gillingham and structured word inquiry and all these things are based on the assumption that the point that the learner encounters an unfamiliar word, they are alone, as you pointed out earlier on, and therefore they must be trained prior to that event to have the quick mental reflexes and knowledge and abstract skills, which is bizarre when you think about it, in order to resolve that confusion before their whole house of cards of comprehension crashes on them. Right? And I'm saying that's all antiquated, archaic 16th century thinking, and that we can make every word in the online universe, which is pretty stunning, elastic and able to help anybody learn to read it. And that once we do, it's not that we wouldn't still have a training wheels component to get people up to being able to use that.
Yeah.
But the amount of abstract instruction that would be required, if every word could respond whenever anybody needed it to,
Yes.
with anything they needed to learn it, is entirely different. But that threatens the government policies and the billions of dollars that are made on reading instructional programs and the guruship and all the rest of it involved in this.
What are you doing now that it's exciting for you?
For me,
other than learning to ski or something like that. Learning to skateboard.
Yeah. This is my life, what we've been talking about. It's not like I have, there's some compartment that's separate from it. The focus of my work is really the Olson piece. And then the other thing is this, the core distinctions about transforming learning, right? That we talked about before. And that's what my life's about, is thinking through that, playing with that, exploring that, dialogues with Gary, with you, with others that I talk with, right? It's like, until such time as we change this frame we have about learning, we're not going to be able to see how learning affects all these other things, and our energies are going to be misdirected. And, whether you talk about, the geopolitical stuff, or you talk about the climate stuff, or in every case, the gap between where we are and some more sane way of being together on this planet, the pathway between them, the shortest pathway between them is learning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's not so much that we need to teach people things, it's we got to stop screwing up how they learn in general, and they'll learn these things.
They'll learn them, right? Yeah. I mean, do you have a sense that, if you could get to the right door, if you could knock on the right door, there's a person out there, not obviously you're not the marketer, and I'm not suggesting marketing, but it strikes me that there's, there are people who are in positions to, for lack of a better term, that they can move things because they have power in that way. Yeah.
Well, the reason I'm doing things the way that I'm doing is that I really think that both governments and the big tech companies would be huge beneficiaries of a lift, a kind of a planetary lift in population learning. Right. And what I'm describing is a very small and inexpensive tweak. I mean, for example, do you remember not that long ago where you had paper maps in your glove box?
Yeah.
and that you had to get them out to know where you were going and to navigate to strange places.
The great step
You,
forward was the Thomas guide, right? I mean, it's like,
yeah,
oh,
oh yeah,
all in one
yeah,
place.
yeah. Wow, isn't that great? Yeah,
And all I have to do is
yeah,
find the next map. Like whatever.
yeah, exactly. Now, do we lament the loss of those things today?
Not a bit.
Okay, so now we all have maps. Now, when was the last time you bought a map?
No.
You don't buy a map. You have
I did. I bought an atlas several years ago because I had a moment of nostalgia. Geez.
Right. Okay.
That was it.
Right. But you have a map today that is off scale, more powerful, more intelligent, more helpful to anything that you might want to do.
In
right?
so many different
and
ways.
And you don't even pay for it.
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Completely free. Yes.
So do you have trouble sleeping at night over the publishers who lost revenue for map sales?
No, I think Rand McNally's doing just fine.
Okay. All right. So the same map model transfers over to what I'm describing.
Yeah. You bet.
Right. It's in everybody's, just like it was in everybody's interest to put these maps in the phones. It's in everybody's interest for the web to work this way. For every word on every electronic, there's a difference between a physically printed word. It's dead, it's inert, it's static. It is what it is.
Right.
But in a word on a display that's being projected by a digital smarts of some kind, that word can be a portal to anything we want.
Yeah.
And it's trivially simple to make it do what I've described. Trivial.
Which is remarkable, actually.
Yeah.
Is that true for the more elaborated descriptions of whether it's in every different language and what it means, or the various meanings of that word? Is that trivial to do as well? That
if you got up into trying to get into PhD level differentiated definitions and explanations, maybe not. But at the level that the mass of humanity would benefit from, yeah. That every different country has its own language bank already, its own translator systems, its own dictionaries and encyclopedias, and pooling them together and cross index is relatively trivial.
I think that's actually one of those things that people, people who are in that world as you are, or have sort of been inside that world as it emerged, and people who, even kids who come to that world afterwards, there's a reminder, like we have to remember, it's not finding it. It's creating it based on a lot of invisible requests. So it really is a living thing, and it could live in a different way if you requested a different thing, and it's there. So yeah, so that's it. Really, God, that's super. I mean, that's exciting. I mean, for somebody, that's an exciting possibility. It's just amazing.
I think so too, and so I hope to kind of create a spark plug event around that. Yeah. And I'm building toward that. In the meantime, that's one main thrust of my work. The other thrust of my work is the talks that I do. Like I'm doing a talk two nights from now to an International Fathers Gathering, and I did one a couple of weeks ago to a regional early child development conference, right? And they vary in attendance and listening, and I'm always happy to get 2% of the audience to actually track with me. I'm not trying to sell anything or persuade anybody or manipulate anything, and that's both my disadvantage and that's the way that is. But like back to the conversation about learning and what interferes with learning. One of the things that I ask people to think about is, have you ever met a toddler that gave up on learning to walk because it was a pain in the ass to fall?
Exactly. That's the skateboarders. Exactly.
Yeah.
The toddlers do it all the time. Like,
yeah. My sense is that human beings are born organismically, profoundly, fundamentally learning oriented.
Yes.
Right. In every way. Yes. Until they learn, they can't trust that anymore.
Right. Yeah, until they learn that learning happens in school, the important learning happens in school, And then they bump into all of those issues.
Yeah. And more granularly, in alignment with what you said, but a step more granularly, it's that their trust is in themselves. It's
Yes.
their own compassing is their center of their trust in that process, right?
Right.
When there's not an acquired or learned belief that they're going to be able to walk.
Right.
It's an abiding, innate, couldn't be otherwise faith and confidence in them, in their own agency, right? And that's what's being destroyed.
Yes, indeed.
In the name of educating them.
Right.
And until we stop that, we're going to be in one variation of madness or another.
Right.
And we can stop that if we recognize that ultimately, whether we're concerned with their happiness or their health or their academic success or their success in relationships or whatever it is, right? How they learn to extend their agency and calibrate their agency and learn to trust and refine and nuance their agency is the key to their success. And that conversely, when kids learn they can't trust that anymore, they've got no choice but to become believers, right? The world is a really threatening, complexly confusing place. And if you don't trust yourself to your own agency to learn into it, you got no choice but to believe in things to keep it at bay.
You bet.
Whether it's Trump or it's religion or whatever it is.
Whatever it is.
Beliefs, our need for belief are the inverse pole of our faith in our own agency.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. I completely agree with that. And I would imagine, well, no, it's hard to imagine people not seeing that. And I guess we're from different worlds, but so everybody's from a different world. And so people's puzzles are different, but you can see it in, you can Google, you can YouTube, the people who are born without limbs or without whatever they are without. And it's miraculous as they go to the grocery store and they pick up the grapefruit with their foot. And it's like, whatever it is, it's so clear that people for the most part, find a path forward and learn to do all those things. They are, quote, disabled, but they're not disabled. And to not be able to see that is a puzzle, right? It's
right.
And a puzzle that more people can't see that. And especially if you're presenting them with a tool that could look, this could be really helpful in a really fundamental way. You must know the data. I don't, but I remember reading just the enormous numbers of illiteracy. Right?
Oh yeah.
It's just
84% of the African American fourth grade children in this country are underwater in reading, and still 80% by the 12th grade. How can they feel good about themselves as learners?
No.
64% of the white kids in between it goes, right? So most kids, their experience of school is a place to go to learn that you can't trust learning.
You can't, right. Yes. Well, you can't trust your ability to learn.
Yeah.
To learn those things. And some people somehow manage to get through that with a sense of confidence about something else. And yes. But on the other hand, the shame transfers, right? So we haven't spoken about that a lot, the shame piece.
Yeah, this is really critical to, I think, the kind of widespread, the biggest learning disability in our population I call mind shame, right? Just like there's body shame and there's all these various shames. You get ashamed of your mind, you're going to avoid things that are mentally challenging, right? In order to avoid that shame, just like you'd avoid strutting around in a bathing suit if you're ashamed of your body or whatever it is, right? So I think the majority of the kids that are chronic strugglers, which is the majority of kids, what they're learning, what they're experiencing is either they have to either not care. So they come up with, like you said, I'm not good enough, which is a tactical overlay that short circuits the shame, because there's a way around the shame by just accepting I'm not good, right? So it shuts that down. Or I'll never be good enough at this or whatever. Or if they continue to care, then they're going to continue to shame. And I think with respect to the art, this is why the artificial confusions are so important, whether it's writing or math or reading. Again, these are artificial constructs requiring artificial learning that doesn't self-reference in the way that natural organic learning does, right? And the confusion associated with those kind of learning challenges, when that kind of precipitates shame, then there can be a linkage between confusion in general and shame in general, and a shame aversion to confusion is profoundly learning disabling, because confusion's involved in all learning,
right? Yes,
right?
exactly.
So that's why I think mind shame's kind of the center of that action, right? And yeah, that's what scares me the most. Like I told you, with my daughter and with the kids that I see, is that I think that kids are being shamed out of their minds en masse, in the sense that they can still function in this, that, or the other things that they believe in, or that they develop a kind of script like response to, rather than an agency learning response to, right? But it endangers their whole life trajectories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a sad thing. That's a sad thing. Well, so tell me, after all this, are you a hopeful person?
Yeah, I am. I mean, it's never been a question. I mean, I think that what we're talking about is inevitable. And the question is, how many people have to suffer until we get there? Yeah. And that, just so many generations. You said something earlier about the way that kids pick up on what their parents are doing, like how their parents are. And for most of human history, if not evolution, you could argue that that was the smart thing, right? That kids were really parent replacements, that they were growing up to replace the adults in pretty limited tracks of functionality in the way societies worked, right?
Right.
And we still have that kind of mentality going on to a significant extent, even though that's long past. Totally. These kids are going to grow up in a world that is. I use a video of taken from an old movie where this guy is just blown away excited as he's talking to his girlfriend a city away on a telephone. Wow, isn't this amazing that we can talk like this? You can hear my voice, And that seems so quaint and so crazy and so, like to us today, right?
Right.
And that juxtapose that with the 6 or 7 year old or even teens that are put in front of a rotary phone and they don't know what the hell to do with the rotary phone.
What to do with it, I know.
Right. And as crazy as all that seems to us, in a couple of generations, if not in just one generation, those people are going to look back at what we think meta reality is and virtual reality and think that it's like that guy on the telephone.
Absolutely, without a doubt.
It's moving so fast
and accelerating.
Accelerating.
Moving so fast and accelerating.
Meantime, we're educating as if we're educating them for 20 years ago.
Oh, it's unbelievable.
What? Yeah. One of my taglines that's kind of the key on one of my websites is nothing's more important to our children's futures than how well they can learn when they get there.
Yes, exactly.
Right. And if you deconstruct that, there's nothing more important to how well they can learn as they get there than their faith and confidence in learning. Mm-hmm. We've got to stop thinking that what we think they should learn or how we think they should learn is more important than how well they can learn, meaning how well they participate and their faith and confidence in learning. It's like we need to be adapting and regulating as if our point is to pull their faith and confidence through this ladder up into proficiencies, not for ignorant of that, just taking them over these steps of proficiencies.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. And
so
in
the
that,
next protocol, giving them
Yeah.
the next protocol.
we're not just a little off, we're 180 degrees out of phase.
Completely off, right? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, at least we agree with each other.
Yeah. Well, your background makes it easier to communicate with than most,
Yeah.
and the fact that you actually really care about kids, obviously, that you've worked with parents that are on the passion edge, and you didn't work in a factory, you worked in a school.
Right. And for some reason, despite the challenges I had with conventional school, there was something about being in a place that, that's I have a faith in, I'm not sure it should be in college anymore, but I have a faith in environments that at least on the page are, learning is encouraged here. Maybe not that kind of learning, but like there is a value for that to get. So I've definitely had that, and that it ought to make sense. Make sense. Because if it doesn't make sense, it's like that was what it was for me. Was like, I don't. Why is everybody else? How does everybody else get this and not me? I wasn't stupid when I walked in here. What happened?
That's a really important point. One of the key observations to me early on with my son was watching how, I don't know if you recall these days, but back in the early 80s, there was a period of time when there were more Nintendo boxes than personal computers in the world, right? Like 35 million Nintendo boxes went boom. And it wasn't because the adults were playing them. It was because the little kids were playing them.
Yeah.
It was almost like the little kid said, finally, something's coherent.
Finally, something makes sense.
Wham! Something makes sense.
Yes.
And there was something about the way that the early games were designed to challenge, but resource, so that you could learn about resources and then learn to creatively apply the resources to overcome the challenges, to stay engaged.
Right.
And that made these.
No, go ahead. I was going to say that to me, the brilliance of, and you can watch it in how people learned, how kids learned, and how their parents learned to play those games. That sort of, thank God for the design, right? You couldn't break this thing. Like, you could throw it, but you couldn't, you die, you whatever, it's screwed up, whatever. They just eagerly restarted it. And parents, you watch it when, people open their Christmas presents and, okay, we're going to set up the VCR now. Okay, so the arrow pointing this way, they're reading the instructions, and the kids are just, they're pushing the buttons and whatever, fearless in that way. There was something about being in that design that it was built so you couldn't screw it up.
Well, to your point a few moments ago, they could trust it.
Yes.
They could trust it. They may not, in other words, it was a question that it wasn't that it was an incoherent, bizarre old mess like the code of reading.
Yes.
It was implicitly, this is solvable. I know that it's solvable. I know that it's coherent. I just got to learn my way to it. And that implicit faith in its coherence made it possible to extend their attention into it in a way that so many other incoherent challenges in school don't.
Right. Yeah. Well, have I exhausted you yet?
Never. But I understand that we've probably come far enough for this.
Well, is there anything else you want to say or talk about or I think
no, I've kind of appreciated the opportunity to just go with the flow, and there's a lot of stuff we haven't talked about, and maybe another occasion, if not necessary, just as friends. I mean, I've enjoyed the dialogue, so we don't have to be in this kind of a setting to do it. the juxtaposition of implicate order and affect science and neuroscience and learning science and all of these things into one with a intention to be via negativa, right? Reducing the obstacles rather than prescripting the path.
Yes, dude. Used to say to parents, I didn't have to say it to kids, but I used to say to parents, like, you know, this is a kind of a place where, yeah, it's kind of true. In order to get through school, there's things that have to be on somebody's transcript and all that. And so, but it's kind of like this room, we're starting over here and you do eventually have to get over there. But there's a lot of ways to get there.
Well, a lot of ways to get there.
This is the kind of a place that, like, other places will tell you where to put your feet to get there. This is the kind of a place that says, hey, try stuff. And, if you keep walking around in the same circle, we'll nudge you once in a while. But there's a lot of ways. So
yeah,
kudos to
beautiful.
you.
Yeah, that's the spirit of the lenses, right? In what I was doing,
Yes,
was that
indeed.
there's no right, the right way is the right way that unfolds in interactive dance with the one that's learning their way.
Yes, indeed. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the hardest thing to do in that was to find the teachers who could encourage, fan the flames of that thing that kids, well, sometimes it had been learned out of them, and now they had to sort of find the embers, and is there a way to bring that back? So
Yeah, unfortunately, that's a huge conversation. Just a headline view of, when I was in Washington talking with people that wrote No Child Left Behind and some of the other people at the Department of Ed, they described to me the reasons for them doing what they were doing, which was viewed as so draconian, was that study after study of teacher corps, including Haberman's work and others, led to the conclusion that roughly 1/3 of the teachers care and are competent. About 1/3 of the teachers are incompetent, but they care. And another 1/3 of the teachers don't care and they're incompetent, right? So they had it broken up like that, right? So 2/3 of the teachers are incompetent and 2/3 of the teachers don't care, right? and in all this bizarro logic, bottom line though is that we have trained the first person learning out of teaching.
yes,
Right. We've wanted them to be robotic extensions of protocols of how to do things rather than first person models of learning
yes,
in action.
I remember, I don't know if it's still happening, but what did they call it? Something court, a reading program in Los Angeles. The school district.
I know what you're talking about.
Open court.
Open court. Yeah, the open court was actually founded by somebody I had lots of conversations with. Yeah,
I remember when that went into place. It was like every kid in the 3rd grade, had to be on this page of this book on Tuesday. It was like that, and that was just like, oh my God.
That's parallel to the whole direct instruction movement, right? Which is hyperscripting what teachers are doing. I know the first time I actually spent 6 hours with the godfather founder of direct instruction, and it was a lot. The bottom line is that we agreed on the need to reduce extraneous ambiguity.
Well, that's a start.
But I would rather create the resources in which the children were learning to creatively apply their way, to learn their way through a space, rather than microscripting how they got through it, right?
You bet.
But in both cases, you got to reduce the extraneous ambiguity.
Yes. Well, yeah. All right. Well,
It's been
David-
wonderful.
David Bolton, it's such a pleasure to both get to know you and to get to hear you and speak. And I look forward to more, not necessarily in this environment, but
Right.
although possibly in this environment.
Yeah,
But,
yeah.
But
We talked about maybe doing something together with Gary where we could
Yeah.
do a deeper dive on how learning and emotion relate to each
yes,
other.
that would be actually really always good when he's in a conversation.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah. No,
very much so.
I'm so grateful for him. Yeah.
Yeah. me too.
All right.
All right.
Thank
well,
you
take
so
care.
much.